The question seemed absurd on its face. Could a single phone call from an old man really cost an airline over $4 billion in less than 10 minutes? On paper, the answer was no. The aviation industry was too structured, too complex, too buffered by legal teams, executive boards, and shareholders to be shaken by something so simple. But that Tuesday morning at Los Angeles International Airport, reality contradicted theory. The incident began with no warning. Just a man, elderly, unassuming, quietly dressed in a threadbare coat, being asked to step off a plane. No questions. No apologies. No verification. The flight crew barely looked him in the eye. Passengers averted their gazes. Security stood stiff and overzealous. The mood in the first-class cabin shifted from disinterest to discomfort. The man didn't resist. He didn't shout. He simply stood, picked up his aged leather suitcase, and walked off the plane in silence. No one on that aircraft knew what they had just done. They had ejected the man who, 12 years ago, single-handedly saved their airline from collapse with a multi-billion-dollar capital infusion. They had shunned Everett Langston. To most of the world, Everett Langston wasn't a household name. He didn't parade through media circuits or attend high-society galas. He didn't own a private island or appear on the covers of glossy business magazines. But in the hidden corridors of high finance, he was a giant. He was the man behind Langston Capital, a firm that once held controlling interest in more than 11% of the domestic airline market. At 78, Everett had long since stepped away from day-to-day operations, but he remained a senior advisor to one of the country's most influential pension funds, an entity controlling over $280 billion in assets. He wasn't interested in power displays or symbols of wealth. He lived in a modest Victorian home in rural New Hampshire, drove a beat-up sedan, and refused to fly private. Years ago, when a young flight attendant had asked him why he chose commercial travel, he had smiled and said, "I need to know how the companies I invest in treat people who can't fight back." And that's exactly what he was doing in Seat 1A on a Skyward Airlines flight, that morning, observing, listening, paying attention. But this time, the system failed spectacularly. It started with a subtle gesture. Everett had squinted at his boarding pass under the cabin's overhead lights, trying to read the faded ink. His eyes, damaged by years in harsh environments from battlefields in Vietnam to boardrooms in Manhattan, struggled with the fine print. That hesitation was all it took. A young security officer named Dylan Reese, eager to assert authority, took notice. Sharp haircut, ironed uniform, and a deeply rooted bias wrapped in official protocol. He approached Everett with skepticism painted on his face. "Sir, may I see your boarding pass?" he asked, his tone edged with suspicion rather than service. Everett handed it over calmly. It had already been scanned, already approved. But Dylan wasn't satisfied. "Can I see your ID?" Everett raised an eyebrow. "I believe the ticket already confirms who I am." Nearby, a flight attendant named Harper Young, new to first-class service, stood frozen, her eyes darting between the older man and the officer. She knew he had boarded correctly, but she didn't speak. "Not yet." Dylan turned to his radio. "Control, I'm dealing with a potential issue in first class. Passenger is uncooperative." The words "potential issue" were enough. Within minutes, backup arrived. Everett was asked to leave the plane. Politely, yet unmistakably. He didn't argue. He only looked at Harper and said softly, "Always speak when silence costs more." And then he walked. The whispers began immediately. He didn't look like someone who belonged in first class. Maybe he bought the wrong ticket. I bet he just wandered up from coach. One woman, seated in 2C, even began filming the encounter. Her name was Rachel Thomas, a graphic designer traveling to pitch her new campaign to a tech firm. She didn't know who Everett was, but something about the scene disturbed her. The quiet dignity of the man, the unjustified urgency of the security officer, the hushed complicity of everyone else. She didn't post the video right away, but her conscience stirred. As Everett sat down near the gate, alone on a cold metal bench, he didn't say a word. He didn't make a scene. He didn't call a lawyer. He called Albert Tran. Albert, the chief operating officer of Langston Capital, answered on the second ring. Mr. Langston, everything okay? Everett didn't waste time. Pull it. All of it. Every cent. No calls. No negotiations. No second chances. Albert froze. You're talking about Skyward? Yes. But that's... I said everything. Albert understood. This wasn't about strategy anymore. It was about principle. Everett Langston had been humiliated not for who he was, but because of who he didn't appear to be. The consequences were swift. Within an hour, Langston Capital froze $2.9 billion in assets tied to Skyward. 2 affiliate funds followed. Pension contributions halted. Preferred stock devalued. Panic spread. Back at Skyward headquarters in Manhattan, the executive team scrambled. Richard Vail, the CEO, was on stage at an aviation summit in Houston when his assistant whispered the news. His face blanched. What do you mean Langston's pulling out? In the boardroom, finance officers shouted over one another. Emails flooded in. Shareholders demanded explanations. Langston Capital just nuked our funding lines. The pension plan is frozen. Can't cover next quarter. Did anyone actually meet with him this week? No one had, because no one thought they needed to. By the time Rachel posted her video that evening, captioned simply, "Who gets to decide who looks rich enough?" social media exploded. Within 12 hours, the clip had 2.4 million views. By the next morning, it had reached 8 million. Every comment echoed outrage. One tweet, pinned to the top, read, "That old man just cost Skyward Airlines $4 billion. All because someone thought his jacket was too worn." News outlets descended. Investigative journalists uncovered Everett's identity. They printed old photos, highlighted his military record, dug up conference speeches, and reminded the world. This was the man who saved the airline during the 2011 crash. The very one they now deemed unfit for first class. Rachel was invited to speak on national news. Her voice trembled. "I didn't know who he was," she said, "but I knew it was wrong." Diane Stanford, a CEO who had nearly spoken up on the flight, was also interviewed. "I was afraid," she admitted. "Afraid of being the one who rocked the boat. But I regret it more than anything." Skyward's shares plummeted 27% in a single trading session. 3 major partners announced their immediate exit. The board convened an emergency meeting at 3 a.m. The head of HR announced Officer Reese's immediate suspension. The flight attendant, Harper, was called INBIT instead of punishment. She received praise. "You tried," her manager said, voice steady. "And that matters." At a televised press conference, CEO Richard Vail stood stiffly before a crowd of journalists. "We failed," he said. "Not just our passenger. We failed our values." He bowed. "To Mr. Langston, and to everyone who has ever been dismissed for looking less than important, we are sorry." Wharton, Harvard, Stanford all integrated the incident into their business ethics curriculum. LinkedIn posts went viral. The phrase, "never judge by the suit, judge by the soul," became a slogan for corporate integrity campaigns. And Everett? He never gave another interview. He never released a statement, never sued. He donated $5 million to an anonymous aviation ethics fund. No press release. No photo op. Just a silent act of correction. Because justice didn't need a podium. It had already spoken through the silence of a man who refused to be angry, refused to shout, and yet made the world listen. The next time someone boarded a flight wearing old shoes and carrying a weathered bag, people thought twice. The lesson was written not in policy documents, but in the collective memory of a stunned nation. Respect, Everett had reminded the world, is not something you earn with wealth. It's something you're owed by being human. And that, on min true value, was how a man who said almost nothing at all changed everything.